A phobia. What is a phobia? We can define a phobia as an anxiety disorder, to use terms from the psychology world, an anxiety disorder that involves significant fear about a specific object or a situation that in reality does not pose a threat. There are literally phobias from A to Z. And typically, when people claim to have these phobias or exhibit the symptoms that are considered to be symptomatic of these phobias, therapy is typically recommended to those who experience this at the level where it starts to bring about behavioral changes that very negatively impact a person's, quote, quality of life. Phobias are actually considered to be one of the most common and prevalent mental health disorders, if we would call it that, in the United States, with 13% of the population claiming to have a phobia at a serious or significant level. As I said, there are phobias from A to Z. We know of acrophobia, which is a fear of heights. Arachnophobia, which is a pretty legitimate one, I think, is a fear of spiders. Claustrophobia is the fear of confined spaces. Some single men have gynophobia, which is a fear of women. Some of you single guys are in that category. There's something called dentophobia, and Dr. Neil McLeod knows about that. It's the fear of dentists. That's legitimate. There's something called mesophobia, which is the fear of dirt and germs. There's something called lochiophobia, which is the fear of childbirth. And so if there are any men in here who have lochophobia, we will send you to the therapist for sure. There are all kinds of phobias. I was looking through the list. There is a formal phobia for a fear of knees, Knees, a fear of knees. A fear of hospitals, perhaps. A fear of cooking, I have that one. Some of our wives have diagnosed us as having a fear of flowers. And there's even something that is called a fear of peanut butter, arachbutyrophobia, a fear of peanut butter, particularly a fear of getting peanut butter stuck on the top of one's mouth. Yes, those all appear in lists of formal phobias. There's also something that is called decidophobia, which is a fear of making decisions. And this particular phobia is described according to these characteristics. It's a significant fear and anxiety about the act of making decisions. It manifests itself in avoidance behaviors that limit situations that require decision-making. People just completely avoid any kind of context where they fear decisions may be required. And it results in significant daily impairment because of this avoidance, fear, and anxiety, because as we know, every moment is made up of decisions. And yet there are people who fear decisions with their life. And this is a common phobia, and it is certainly a phobia that is addressed and dealt with in the book of Ecclesiastes, particularly chapter 11. And what does this phobia come from? The fear of making decisions. Well, Solomon is going to address that, but before we get to Ecclesiastes 11, it's important to note that Solomon has spent many chapters already of Ecclesiastes reminding us over and over again that life is a vapor. Life is brief. But not only is life a vapor, the extent of the life that we do have is unpredictable. It's uncertain. that outside the Garden of Paradise, in a world that groans underneath the curse of sin, there are circumstances that we cannot foresee. And try as we might to avoid them, God does send us what Solomon calls bent circumstances. He sends us adversity. He sends us enigmas, those unpredictable things in life. And certainly what is important for Solomon, first and foremost, is to help us understand that this is what life under the sun in the world outside of the garden is comprised of. Shortness of life. It can be taken even in youth. And along the way, there will be injustices. Along the way, we will encounter adversity. There will be unexplainable pains. There will be grief, because this is the world under the curse. And Solomon teaches us this lesson not only so that we would come to terms and be reconciled with that reality, but he teaches us these lessons because he wants to help us navigate life in light of this grief. There's a certain video clip that's making the social media rounds today. It's one of our Pastor John, and he doesn't say anything that is controversial to us, but many people take it as controversial. And part of what he said as he deals with or speaks on the issue of some of these mental disorders is he says this: grief is a part of life. And if you can't navigate grief, you can't live life. That's what Solomon is getting to in Ecclesiastes chapter 11. After contending that there are uncertainties in this world, you cannot expect guarantees. There are these unpredictable griefs that you will encounter. Life is short. And not only that, but you will work hard and you may have nothing to show for it at the end. You may be the recipient of injustice. These are all part and parcel of the world in which we live. There will be grief. It is a part of life. Solomon wants us to come to terms with that reality, but he also wants us to properly navigate that. And we can say this today, that the tremendous explosion of all the different kinds of disorders that we see in the world today all spring from this inability to deal with grief, with the inability to deal with the adversity that comes our way, the inability to respond properly to the brevity of life, the fact that this life is but a vapor and there are no guarantees as to what you will accomplish or receive in the years that the Lord gives you here. But Solomon wants to guide us through that quagmire. And this is what Ecclesiastes 11 teaches us. The inappropriate response to the reality of grief and uncertainty is not to retreat. It's not to get angry. It's not to become vexated. It's not to surrender. It's not to become paralyzed. Instead, Solomon calls upon us with the realization of what we will encounter in this world. He calls upon us to move forward boldly and joyfully. And we're going to follow Solomon's thought around those 2 points, that we are to move forward in life knowing these things with boldness, and we are to move forward in life knowing these things with joy. Let's look at the first of these. And we see this in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 1 to 6. And I'm going to entitle this point, this section, and I'm going to give it this exhortation in summation of Solomon's words. Don't just stand there, do something. Don't just stand there, do something. Solomon begins with a proverb in verse 1, one of the more well-known proverbs in the book of Ecclesiastes. He says, "Cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days." Now, over time, interpreters have struggled over this verse and have basically landed in one of two categories, and there's a lot of support for each one of these views. The first view says this, that what Solomon is exhorting here is for us to engage in generous acts of charity. Generous acts of charity. Bread here, as it is used in Ecclesiastes, refers on the one hand to the reward for one's labor. You could look at Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 7, where Solomon says, "Go then, eat your bread in happiness." He's referring there to the enjoyment of the fruit of one's labor. And so the idea of this view is that bread, on the one hand, is the reward for our labor. It's the wealth that we gather from our work, and we are to take that bread and give it to the most needy. We are to cast that bread on the surface of the waters. And then as you look at the rest of verse 1, Solomon says, "You will find it after many days." And the essence of that statement is that charity toward others has a tendency to come back and benefit you. You're never left in the lurch. You're never shortchanged for the acts of charity that you do for others. And certainly there is biblical wisdom to this. You could look at a lot of texts in the Old and New Testament, but look at, for example, Proverbs 19, verse 17. There Solomon says, "One who is gracious to the poor man lends to the Lord, and he, the Lord, will repay him for his good deeds." That certainly fits with the idea of casting the bread on the water and finding it after many days. You could even look at Luke chapter 16, verse 9, where Jesus says that you are to use your wealth to make friends, so that when it fails, they will receive you into eternal dwellings. Use your wealth to make friends spiritually, so that they will await you in heaven. But there's another view, and this view takes the approach that what Solomon is focused on here is not necessarily charity, although it doesn't deny the benefit and necessity of charity, but instead, Solomon is here exhorting us to engage in business ventures. Where do we get that from? Well, first of all, when you look at the verb to cast, it actually means, literally, it means to send or to let loose. And so the idea is that something is being let loose, it's being sent to accomplish something, and bread here is idiomatic or metaphorical of a commodity like wheat or grain. And so one commentator translated this statement as follows: "Ship your grain across the sea." The idea behind this exhortation is that Solomon here is exhorting us to industriousness and is saying that industriousness will, in the long term, bring back many benefits. And this fits with Solomon. For example, in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 22, we read that this is what, in part, made Solomon so wealthy. He had ships at sea, for the king had at sea the ships of Tarshish with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish came bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. So King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. Now, what is the proper view here? I think the second actually has a little bit more merit, because when we look at the context, particularly of verses 2 to 6, as we go through this text, we're going to see that Solomon is talking a lot about industry and enterprise, and he focuses specifically, as would be expected in that culture, he focuses on agriculture. But with either interpretation, the gist of the proverb is still the same. We are faced with choices that have no guarantees. whether it is an opportunity to extend charity or whether it is an opportunity to be industrious and engage in enterprise, the point is there are no guarantees. There are no guarantees. Solomon has spent a large part of this book already, as we've already mentioned, emphasizing the brevity of life. It's short, and that life is unpredictable. Death is certain, and adversity is likely. And the natural response to such a reality is to become paralyzed. Or even for some to say the sky is falling. Some others would hoard materials, or some would merely retreat. But Solomon is exhorting us here, in light of all of the assertions he has made about the brevity of life, that retreat and paralysis is not an appropriate response. It's not a way to steward what God has given to you, as little as that may be or as much as that may be. There is a far greater likelihood, Solomon says, regardless of all the adversity and uncertainty, there is a far greater likelihood that you will find benefit from being courageous and taking action than you will find if you retreat into yourself, if you climb under a rock and simply do nothing. To do nothing, Solomon says, is not a response. I was thinking of this, and there's a lot of practical applications we could make to it, but one of the ways that you kind of see this retreat or surrender, paralysis or hoarding, this improper response to the uncertainties of this world is what we see today in the declining birth rates, even among Christian families. And you'll talk to young couples, and they'll say, we don't want to have kids. And the question then follows is, why not? And the answer is, well, we're not sure of the world that is going to be there for them 20 years from now. Or we're not sure if we'll have the money to take care of them, or in some cases, we're not sure because we want to keep as much money for ourselves to travel and to enjoy life. The low birth rates, in many regards, even among some Christians, reflects a fear of bringing children into the world. And that is manifest in the same kind of paralysis or the same kind of hoarding or the same kind of retreat that Solomon is addressing here. And Solomon is not allowing us to do nothing. Solomon instead says, knowing all of these things, the best thing for you in life is not to be paralyzed. It is to move forward with courage. Notice verse 2. He continues this emphasis. He says, risk is indeed a reality. You cannot stand still. You must move forward, do something. But knowing risk, he then says, be wise. Verse 2, divide your portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. Now, initially, this almost sounds contradictory to what he has just said in verse 1. In verse 1, he's called us to be industrious. He's called us in a very direct way to take risks. But now he tempers that and says, but before you go the wrong way, exercise wisdom. And in the second half of this verse, you really find the essence or the key idea in these verses, in this context of verses 1 through 6. And it is this: you cannot predict the future. And there are no guarantees of success as you might define them. In fact, we just go back to last week's study when we were in chapter 10, and we saw in verse 14 that it was the fool who believed that he knows what will happen. And Solomon says that's foolish. He says the same thing here. You do not know. There are no guaranteed outcomes. Be courageous. Be willing to take risks when you don't have guarantees. But as you move forward, you must minimize your exposure to these unknowns. He says, divide your portion, divide that industriousness to 7 or even to 8. Now, he's not saying that everyone has to have everything divided in just 7 or 8. It's an idiom, a common Hebrew expression to say that there is a multitude, there's an indefinite amount, there's an assorted amount, and you need to make sure you're not singularly vested. Solomon essentially provides the kind of practical advice that we give today in our own little proverbs. We'll sometimes say, don't hang everything on one hook. You know how that's like. You have that hook at home and you hang all the coats on that thing and the hook breaks. It's not made for all the coats. Or we say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. You drop that basket and all the eggs break. And Solomon is saying this, yes, take risks. Be adventurous. Be courageous. Yes, there is adversity in life. Therefore, because of that, don't let that adversity cause paralysis. Instead, you mitigate those risks by mitigating the exposure. Solomon then goes on and gives several parallel word pictures, these dual word pictures that help us understand both our limitations and inabilities as well as the importance of moving forward despite those inabilities. He begins in verse 3 with this reality check. He says, if the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth. And whether a tree falls toward the south or toward the north, or wherever the tree falls, there it lies. In this particular set of word pictures, Solomon is emphasizing the fact that we are unable to predict, to control our environment. We are unable to control our environment. Yes, we can see when the rain clouds are coming, there's rain there, and it will drop. But we can't control the development of those clouds, and we can't control where they drop the rain. We just know that it will happen. He also refers to the fallen tree. Once a tree falls, we can't rewind the clock and put it back up and make it fall in a different direction. There's an inevitability to that. And that reminds us that we cannot control our environment. That has not been given to us. Nonetheless, we are to move forward in such a way, recognizing that inability to control, but still being faithful stewards of what God has given us. He gives us, in verse 4, another reality check. He says, he who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. This proverb emphasizes the inability to predict your environment. Watching the wind is not a good discipline for the one who needs to go sow. The soil is ready, the seed is ready, but looking at the trees to see which way they're bending and to see how they're bending and to try to prognosticate what will come next is not the proper response. Go out and sow. Go out and sow. You can't predict whether the wind will grow stronger or less. You can't predict what kind of weather is going to come next. He says the same at looking at clouds, that if you're a harvester and your grain is in the field ready to be harvested, you can't look at the clouds and wonder, well, perhaps tomorrow might be a better day. No, the grain is ready. Go, harvest the crop. Do not be paralyzed by what may be. In fact, what Solomon is dealing here in this particular set of word pictures is that problem of what we call analysis paralysis. That paralysis that comes from overthinking, from overanalyzing, from being stuck and not doing anything because we're always looking for more information. And Solomon says, look, there's a point, yes, where you exercise wisdom, mitigate the risks, but there's a point where you have to move forward. You can't become paralyzed. As William Barrick says on this particular text, over-hesitancy in making decisions involving risk can result in the best time passing by during that inactivity. The paralysis of inaction results in lost opportunities. There's another word picture that he gives in verse 5, another reality check. He says this, just as you do not know the path of the wind or how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. This particular proverb emphasizes man's inability to comprehend his environment. Solomon is saying, look, you can never wait until the time where you understand everything. That time will never come. And in the meantime, you will lose opportunity. He uses, first of all, the idea of choosing the path of the wind. He's referred to this numerous times already in Ecclesiastes about how we cannot control the path of the wind. Now he says you cannot understand how that path is chosen by the wind. The route that gusts of wind takes is utterly incomprehensible. We can't predict it. Moreover, he points to the miracle of the baby's development in the womb and how that development takes place from that fertilized egg to the appearance of bones in the womb. How can that be? And he argues here then from the lesser things to the greater, from very specific things, acts of nature, as well as the formation of a baby in the womb. And then he argues from that to the bigger and says, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. God is in control of everything. He directs the wind and he forms the baby. You don't understand that. That belongs to him, and you must realize that is not and never will be part of your comprehension. Allow it to exist in mystery. Move forward. Don't just stand there. Do something. He then concludes this section in verse 6 with this summary statement. He says, sow your seed in the morning, and do not be idle in the evening. For you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. Again, as Solomon is saying, you can't control, you can't predict, you can't comprehend your environment. Paralysis is not an option. So living without guarantees does not mean you just stay there and stay stationary. It requires you nonetheless to take advantage of the opportunities that you do have. And you can't say, well, I've got an opportunity here, so I'll take half of it. I'll sow in the morning, and I'll let pass by the opportunity to sow in the evening. Solomon says, don't do that. That's not the wise approach. Instead, as Derek Kidner says, the true response to uncertainty is a redoubling of the effort. That when God does open the doors, don't just stand there. Go through the door and do so with courage, with boldness, with effort. Don't leave it half behind and half undone. Sow in the morning and in the evening, because you don't know which one will turn out best. And that is a helpful reminder for us. Before we move to this next section, I was thinking through this and how it applies particularly to men, and thinking about how it is the antithesis of what it means to be a man, to be one who can't make decisions, to suffer from that disorder of decidophobia, of not being able to make decisions. Let me give you a few examples here. I'll probably step on numerous toes. That's okay. I'm not afraid of toes. Single men. Some of you may have been courting a woman for quite some time. And she's a godly woman. She loves Christ. She loves the church. But you just can't pop the question. and you keep leading her on. And you just keep thinking, well, maybe next month I'll be certain. And meanwhile, you've known her for 3-4 years. And you keep leading her on, but you're unable to pop the question. That is decidophobia. She loves the Lord. Pop the question. Ask her to marry you. We're plagued by a lot of young men today who simply don't have the courage to do what's necessary to create a family. Single men, listen to Solomon's words. Don't just stand there, do something. Inactivity and paralysis is not becoming of you as a young man. Or perhaps young fathers. You know that your job is really a dead end. It's not going to allow you to move up. It just is providing you right now with just enough to survive, and your wife would love to have kids. And you're stuck in this job. She keeps telling you, honey, is there a different job you could apply for? Is there something else that you can do? And you keep acknowledging something needs to be done, but week after week after week, you just remain where you are. Young man, you need to listen to Solomon. You need to get out of that rut. You need to put off that phobia. You need to make some decisions. Or perhaps it's an opportunity for you in your company, in your business where you work. You've been given an invitation to move up into leadership. And you know that that's going to require stretching. It's going to require training. It's going to require some uncomfortable sacrifices, and yet you'll be given an opportunity to bring integrity to the company and Christian influence to the company, and you're scared. And you don't know what to do, and so you just keep putting it off. That's decidophobia. Solomon would say, man, get with it. Yes, there are uncertainties. You may only last a couple of months and get fired, but you have an opportunity, and it looks good, and this is wise. You have an opportunity to bring Christian influence to the next level and influence your company with integrity. Do it. What are you waiting for? Yeah, you're not going to know the outcome. That's okay. You don't know what will happen. That's okay. That's not in your hands to decide. Don't just stand there. Move forward. Or perhaps it's a ministry opportunity. You've been feeling a long time that you need to do more for the glory of Christ in some way, and for the church, and some way for the Great Commission. And it keeps coming to your mind. You keep feeling conviction. You know you got to do something, but you just keep procrastinating. Maybe it's you got to go to seminary for training. Maybe it's you got to go to talk to your pastor and say, listen, I'm ready for the next level. You know that that's what would honor the Lord, and yet you're remaining silent. That's decidophobia. Make a decision, move forward, be bold and courageous. Solomon is telling us here that yes, life is short. God has given you whatever he's given you. You're to steward those things. You don't know what the outcome is, but the last thing you need to do is to crawl under a rock or to remain in the same place. And we as Christians, and this is what is different, we as Christian men, we have the paradigm for handling grief. We have the paradigm, we have the instruction, we have the Spirit of Christ in us to enable us to properly handle adversity. So it means that we can take those risks of moving forward, even though we know that there may well be very uncomfortable circumstances there. You might get fired in a couple of years. Yes, it's easier to stay beneath the radar. But we as Christians know how to handle that. Solomon has given us this book in order for us to navigate that grief and not be paralyzed and remain in the same spot. Don't just stand there, men. We have what it takes to move forward. Secondly, Solomon says, don't be paralyzed. Instead, rejoice. And again, I say rejoice. And this is found in the final verses of chapter 11, in verses 7 through 10. Solomon splits up his instruction here between words directed at the old man and words directed at the young man. First, he turns to the old man. He says in verses 7 and 8, "The light is pleasant, and it is good for the eyes to see the sun. Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all, and let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything that is to come will be futility." He begins with this reference to light, and he talks about it being good for the eyes to see the sun. He contrasts it with days of darkness. But when he refers to the light and how good it is, that light is pleasant, that of course is an idiom that extends to all areas of life, but he's basically saying this: light is a sign of God's blessing. From the words of Jesus himself, he says, God causes the sun to shine on the righteous and on the unrighteous. It is evidence of God's general goodness. And Solomon is calling upon old men here to recognize the simple things in life, the simple, pleasant blessedness in life. The light is pleasant, and it's good for eyes to see the sun. Rejoice in something that simple. The days of darkness are there too. Certainly, those are the days of adversity. So be enjoyed by the days of the light. Now, previously, he has mentioned, we must note this, that he referred, if we go back to chapter 4 and chapter 6, that there are some cases where it's better not to see the light of day. He talks, for example, about the stillborn child. But when Solomon discussed that, he was at low points in his life. And he was looking at life merely under the umbrella of life under the sun. In those moments, he was not looking at it as to what is above the sun. And so as one commentator said here, Solomon now looks beyond his gloomy vistas to see God. And as he does, he says, you know what, there is a lot of pleasantness in the most simple things of life, even enjoying that light. But as he says that, he gives two obligations to the old man. He says, first of all, he says, let him rejoice. The man who has lived many years, let him rejoice. And the focus of that man's rejoicing is to be in all the years that he has lived, all those years that he has already passed through. Now, you might say, well, that's an appropriate exhortation to someone who's had it easy in life. Yes, tell that man, tell him to rejoice in all his years. But Solomon is not referring to the man who has had it easy. Notice what he says in the second exhortation. He not only says, rejoice, but remember. He says, and let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Let him remember. This is the same command given to the same individual, and Solomon is actually saying, rejoice, and at the same time, cultivate the remembrance of the adversity through which you have traversed. What Solomon is saying is that adversity is not a killjoy. Now, that's our natural response. We automatically, because of our flesh, think that all kinds of adversity are all the reasons to become angry, all the reasons to become bitter and resentful. Look at what has happened to me. But Solomon says at this point, as he's going past those gloomy vistas, and as he's putting his focus on the one above the sun, he's saying this, you know what? A reflection upon the adversities of life actually help you to be joyful. They put everything in perspective. They remind you of who you really are. They remind you of who God really is. And as you go through all of that and reflect upon all of that, it will help you be joyful. That's the right approach. And listen, older men, to the degree that you cultivate this is the degree to which you will enjoy a spiritually healthy old age. Enough with this caricature of the old man being grumpy. Solomon says the old man above everyone must be joyful. And there are some of those men in our midst. I think of a Dick Martin. He is a man who smiles. That's the kind of man that Solomon is pointing us to here and is saying adversity is not a killjoy. Moreover, Solomon even says everything that is to come, it's translated as futility, but understand that word is that word hebel. It should be translated instead that everything that is to come is a vapor. It's brief. It's a breath of air. But despite that, be joyful. Solomon then turns to the young men in verses 9 through 10, and he says to young men, rejoice. There we have that second command. Rejoice, run after, and renounce. Let's look at this in a little more detail, verses 9 and 10. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood. And follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all of these things. So remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. He says to the young man, he calls him a man in his childhood. It's a way of referring to the early years of vitality. And he prescribes 3 exhortations here. First of all, he again says, rejoice. Rejoice. Let your heart be pleasant, he says. And what he's saying here is that a young man is not to wait until his old age to cultivate joyfulness. Not at all. Yes, old men are to be joyful. They're to rejoice. But listen, young men, in your years of vitality and the years of young manhood, when you got all these things going on, a very crucial discipline to cultivate that will be the key to your health moving forward. The ability to deal with all the adversity that is yet to come on the path of life is to cultivate this joyfulness. Young men, rejoice. He then continues with the second. He says, and follow the impulses of your heart. This goes back to what he said in verse 1, cast your bread upon the waters. Follow the impulses of your heart and the desire of your eyes. Solomon is saying here, young men who are strong and have energy, you are to run hard. You are to be active. You are to do hard things. That's your calling. Now, this is not, at the same time, it's not a call to hedonism. Solomon isn't just saying live for the flesh. He's already dealt with that numerous times in Ecclesiastes because he tried it. It was empty. He's not saying just live for pleasure. He's not saying that. In fact, immediately after he says run hard after your desires, he qualifies that with the important guardrails. Those guardrails is the knowledge of God's righteousness. Notice what he says. He says, yet know that God will bring you to judgment. Now, 4 times already in this section, back in verses 2, 3, and chapter 11, and verse 6, twice, Solomon says, you don't know, you can't know, you don't know. Now he says, you must know. You must know that God is righteous. He will bring to judgment all of these things. So with that in mind, with the recognition of God's righteousness and final judgment, of both reward and judgment, in light of those 2 things, choose within those boundaries what is according to God's righteous laws, whatever fits, and run hard after that. Reminds me of what Pastor John counsels in that little book, Found God's Will. And some of you may need this book, specifically in response to this text, because the question often is, what is God's will for my life? And men often get paralyzed by not having those guarantees. And what are the guarantees that men look for today? They want a word from the Lord. They want an inner voice or something written on the clouds, some prophecy that will give them a guarantee of what they are to do. And that's not going to come. Solomon says it won't. So what is God's will for my life? How can I refuse to get stuck and fall into this decidophobia? Well, Pastor John lays it out well in that little book. First of all, he gives 5 principles. This is God's will for you. You be saved. You come to know the fear of God. You be spirit-filled. You be sanctified. You be submissive, and you suffer. That's right where you need to be. And you might say, okay, I've checked off these boxes, but what do I do with my career? Or what do I do with my family? Do I get married? All those kinds of questions. And here's Pastor John's answer. If you are doing all 5 of the basic things, do whatever you want. Follow the desire of your heart. Follow the desire of your eyes. Move forward. Just don't stay where you're at. And finally, and very importantly, Solomon in chapter 11 of Ecclesiastes, in verse 10, gives us something for young men to renounce. Something for young men to remove or to renounce. He says this, so remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. Hebel, a vapor. He calls upon them to remove grief and anger. Why does he reference that? Because those are the common responses to adversity. Those are the things that weigh men down. That inability to deal with adversity that leads to grief, which then leads to anger. It leads to retreat. It leads to surrender. It leads to crawling under a rock or lashing out. And Solomon very specifically says, yes, there are no guarantees. Yes, there is adversity in this life. Yes, you will suffer. You will have pain, but don't cling to it. Instead, renounce all of those things and keep moving forward. Rejoice, run hard, and renounce. Renounce that vexation that you inflict on your body through all of that anxiety that you build up as you don't deal properly with the adversities of life. The prime of life is fleeting. Those years are not going to stand still, even if you try to make them. They will keep moving, so you must move. Now, what are some applications very quickly for this? Number 1, uncertainty is not an excuse. A good steward will take wise risks. You can't stand in the same spot. There are no guarantees, but it's no excuse for paralysis. You got to move. Number 2, old men, mortify that perception that you have a right to be grumpy. Mortify that idea that the sweetness of life has ended. You, most of all, have reason to truly rejoice. You have lived a life, and even in light of all that adversity, you've learned many lessons, and you can rejoice in light of the adversity. Young men, number 3, learn to rejoice now. And this is going to be that fundamental key to your success, your spiritual health as you move forward. God has told you in Ecclesiastes that you will encounter adversity. There are no guarantees. Life is brief. You may not get what you think you deserve. God is sovereign. God is good. He is to be feared. He is righteous. And learn to cultivate joy in light of all that. You do, and you will be healthy. Finally, let us remember this. Number 4, adversities and uncertainties are not to kill our joy. To the God-fearer, they promote joy. It's like what James said in James chapter 1, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you face variegated trials, knowing that those trials produce the perfection of faith. Let's pray. Once again, Father, we are in awe at the practicality of your word coming from Ecclesiastes, from the pen of one who teaches us so much, both through his mistakes and errors as well as through his recovery. We thank you for these very clear exhortations, these reminders that we don't need to know, we won't know the future, that we don't need guarantees to move forward, to take bold and courageous steps. So we pray, Father, that you would impress these exhortations deep within us, and all of us would understand better as a result of Ecclesiastes 11 what it means to steward what you've been given, not to hide it in a field, but to use it for your glory, for the advantage of others around us, for the advantage of our families, for the advantage of the church, for the Great Commission, and even for our own enjoyment. You are a good God, and in the midst of adversity, you have intended for us to have joy. May we find it more truly as a result of this text. It's in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.